drunks, lazy, dangerous. These are just some of the words thrown at Irish people in Britain in barely controlled anger and hatred directed towards the Irish community down the centuries. It could often spill over into outright hatred and even violence. Yet Britain needed the Irish. Every year for decades, thousands of people would leave their homes and families in the west of Ireland and travel to Britain to work on the harvest and bring in the food Britain needed. They also built houses and roads, often taking on the hardest of jobs. And they did all this living in awful conditions, often vilified by the press. So why were the Irish treated like this if Britain needed them so much? People might point to the IRA or the Troubles, but this is a story that runs far deeper than that. It's about how British society in general viewed Ireland and the Irish. To understand this history, we need to widen the story, looking at deportations during the Great Hunger back to Ireland, all the way through to suspicious deaths in more recent times. But let's go back to the 19th century, when Irish communities were already well established in many British towns and cities. Irish migration to Britain goes back centuries, but by the 1860s there was about 800,000 Irish-born people living in Britain. Now that was only 3% of the overall population, but the Irish community were heavily concentrated in certain cities. So in Liverpool, for example, 1 in 5 people living in the city had been born in Ireland by the 1860s. And there were huge Irish communities in cities like London, Birmingham, Manchester and Glasgow. But despite this long presence, the Irish had always been treated with a degree of suspicion and fear. And this comes back to the history between England and Ireland. Ireland had been part of the UK since 1800, but before that it had been England's oldest colony. This had seen centuries of violence and ruthless exploitation of Ireland, and this had led to an image in Britain that Ireland, and indeed the Irish themselves, were inherently violent. But beyond this, there was a major sectarian divide. Protestant Britain imagined itself as industrialised, civilised and disciplined, while they saw Catholic Ireland as backward, disorderly and lazy. And this all fed into widely held beliefs that the Irish were not only lazy and drunkards, and on top of that, they could be violent. And these stereotypes have had terrible consequences down the centuries. If we go back to the Great Hunger of the 1840s, when Ireland faced starvation and famine, tens of thousands of Irish people were deported from English cities and towns back to Ireland because it was believed they had come to England to essentially sponge off English people, but they were sent back to an Ireland that was in the grip of famine. 70 years later, the outbreak of the Irish War of Independence in 1919 only heightened these old stereotypes. For example, in 1928, a Conservative government published a report that linked crime and Irish immigrants in Britain. This, for example, was one line in that report:
that the elimination of the Irish from Scotland would reduce the crime statistics by 75 to 80%.
But this all begs the question, if the Irish were treated like this, why did they keep coming in such large numbers? If we first look at the Irish themselves, many of them had little choice in the matter. Ireland was a deeply poor country through the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. But this was partly because of its historic relationship to Britain. Ireland had been structured in such a way that it provided huge amounts of labour for the British economy. Indeed, alongside those big Irish communities that I talked about at the start of the video, each spring, thousands and thousands of Irish people left their families in Ireland and came to work in Britain on the harvest. And they were highly sought after by British farmers because they were highly skilled rural labourers who could bring in the harvest very efficiently. And they were essential not only to the British economy, but to the survival of British people. They fed British cities. So this relationship of Irish migrants moving to Britain benefited both countries. Irish people were undoubtedly poor at the time, but Britain needed their expertise of working on the land, and alongside that, the labour they provided in cities. But yet, the Irish remained on the margins of British society, and living on the margins had terrible consequences. For example, the seasonal labourers who came to England every year often slept in cowsheds on the farms where they worked, and this only heightened the stereotype that the Irish were dirty and poor. In this atmosphere, the Irish then were viewed with suspicion, and this could have terrible, terrible consequences. In 1937, 10 Irish labourers who had come to Scotland for the harvest died in a fire in the barn where they were sleeping at a place called Kirklintock outside Glasgow. Now that fire at the time was deemed to be accidental, but if you look at this newspaper report beside me, in the 1980s, an old woman on her deathbed revealed that she believed that the fire had actually been set intentionally. Now it was 50 years later and the police were unable to bring charges, but that highlights the conditions and atmosphere that many of these seasonal Irish labourers lived in while they worked to feed British society. Now, bad as the conditions that many of the Irish lived in Britain were, they could get even worse at times of vulnerability, in times of crisis, when the Irish were often scapegoated for wider problems that Britain faced. The Great Depression of the 1930s is a prime example of this. So after the Wall Street crash in 1929, Britain's economy went into a tailspin. The country was seriously suffering. There were hunger marches, as many in the north of England were thrown out of work. However, rather than blame the politicians and industrialists who had caused this recession, many directed their anger against the Irish. Increasingly in the British press, there was talk of an Irish invasion when the seasonal labourers arrived to bring in the harvest, even though British farmers repeatedly said that they needed these labourers to come to Britain. Pretty much right across the board, British institutions and organisations turned on the Irish. Trade unions organised protests against Irish labourers who were working in Britain. Church leaders railed against the Irish from the pulpit. Listen to these words from a Methodist preacher in the north of England in the 1930s, a guy called Major Dane.
The unemployment question is complicated by the invasion of something like 3 million Irish workers since 1915. West Scotland, Lancashire, Cumberland and South Wales are almost entirely dominated by this Irish immigration.
While much of that anger was targeted at seasonal labourers coming in, even in the big cities where there was large Irish communities, the Irish were still targeted. For example, in Liverpool, where earlier in the video I mentioned how there was a huge Irish population in that city, the Irish were still targeted, there was protests against them. There was even a political organisation set up called the Irish Immigration Investigation Bureau, and they produced very questionable statistics about Irish people in Britain and what they were doing there. They also organised demonstrations, feeding into a toxic atmosphere where increasing anger was directed at the Irish. Now, many of you will wonder what impact IRA campaigns had on this. For example, in 1939, the IRA launched a campaign targeting British cities. And there's no question this did see an upsurge in vilification of the Irish in the British press and also in wider British society. However, this actually proves my point. Regardless of whether British people were angry at the IRA, there was no reason to take out this anger on the Irish community as a whole. They're two distinct things, but there was a general sense that you could lump all Irish people together. They were stereotyped as poor, Catholic, and then at times dangerous. And this continued for decades into much more recent times. If we look at the outbreak of the Troubles from the late 60s onwards, there's countless examples of Irish people being punished pretty much because they're Irish. So if we look at cases like the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, or the Maguire 7, they were people who were imprisoned for their supposed role in IRA attacks. However, there was no evidence that these people had participated in these attacks. Much of the case seems to have been built around racial profiling and the fact they were Irish. Those people, however, would go on to spend decades in prison. All for, as the song goes, the crime of being Irish. And so much of this comes back to the way the Irish in general were viewed in Britain, where we started this video, that these stereotypes about being lazy or then at times dangerous. Now, there's no question in recent decades, the position of the Irish has improved in Britain. You don't get the same level of discrimination or attacks on the Irish community as you would have in the 1980s or the 1930s or back in the decades after the famine. However, many of the underlying causes do remain: the racism, the colonial attitudes, the sectarianism, and we can see that today in Britain when it's directed at other communities. For example, in the 1950s, you had a large wave of immigration into Britain known as the Windrush generation, who came in from the Caribbean, and they have been treated very poorly, with strong echoes of the Irish experience down the decades, even in recent years. And then today even, we can look at how British Muslims are being treated. Again, there are very strong echoes about the way Irish people were treated in the past. It's the same tired stereotypes with the same dangerous results. Now, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. If you've lived or live in the UK, I'd love to hear your experiences. Does this tally with what you've experienced in Britain? Or maybe you've had a completely different experience. I'd love to hear that. If you enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe. I've got lots of great content on the way. So I'll be talking to you again soon. Until then, slán.